Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for the Amazing Race 37 following episode 2, which was just kind of a fun episode. Definitely an interesting format once again, with there being the intersection and some interesting results here, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 12 teams to talk about, and so it's more time. Let's get into the video. So, starting off at number 12, we have the latest boots from the season, and here we have Ernest and Bridget, who I did have relatively low compared to their placement in last week's ranking, considering while they did get third place, they got pretty much no content outside of that, no personal content, only for them to get their intro package at the beginning of this episode, which made me think that they were probably going home by the end of it, considering that's a common editing trend on the show. And sure enough, that's what happens here, where while they were first place coming out of the airport and while they were on the first flight, they really fell behind during the intersection where them along with Brett and Mark really just fell behind on that task, really struggled with it, causing them to fall all the way to the back of the pack. And from that point on, they really struggled. They were obviously the last to get to the detour, last to finish it, and they were eliminated here, where that intersection really defined their race here. And in general, I feel like they were just kind of fine racers. This team that was able to do well in one leg, but just completely collapsed thereafter. And obviously, that's all pretty unfortunate. But at the same time, I feel like they were just kind of a fine team on the show from an entertainment perspective. And they're now out of the game to where they're here at number 12. And with that, we have 11 teams left in the race to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how lucky I think they are to win the race based on their edit and current race position. But at number 11, the team that I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Han and Holden. And to me, this episode was more the same for them, where they once again had a very middling finish, where they came into this leg in 11th place, and while they were able to get on the second flight and be in the middle of the pack there, they really fell behind on the way to the intersection and weren't really able to catch up as much as the other teams, to where by the end of it, they ended up being second to last, where despite them being ninth place coming into the detour, they kind of fell behind other teams as a result of that. And beyond that, this episode also gave us their personal content, getting more content about how they don't really get along and how they're going to be their own worst enemy. And in general, I feel like they're being set up to be this more dysfunctional team, a team that really struggles with working together, and a team that's just perpetually in the back of the pack. So not feeling too great about them at this point, which is why they're here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another team that I'm just not feeling that great about, even though this wasn't the worst leg for them from a race standpoint. By number 10, we do have Pops and Jeff. And admittedly, this is technically a better leg for them, where while they came into the leg in 10th place, they were able to make up some ground coming into the intersection, being 8th place there. They're able to be 8th place coming into the detour, and they're able to be successful on that detour, being one of the few teams to choose the Mochi detour. And that's actually also where we get our personal content from them, where they get their intro package talking about being lumberjacks, which felt kind of random there. And they do end up finishing the leg in 7th place. So again, it's not the worst leg for them in the world. However, I feel like I'm probably a bit higher on other teams after this particular leg for them. And I feel like even with their intro package, a lot of it felt pretty circumstantial, with a lot of it tying into the fact that their background as lumberjacks was related to the actual tasks they were doing. So at the end of the day, I'm still not feeling the best about them. And I can't really imagine them being winners of the season, which is why they're here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another team that probably didn't do the worst in the world on this particular leg, but I'm probably just higher on other people. And here we have Melinda and Erica. And this was actually a pretty strong leg for them from a race perspective, where they actually came into the leg in last place, being in last place there, but they were able to make up a lot of ground, where they were able to sneak their way onto the second flight, despite them initially being pegged for the latest flight. And they're able to make up a lot of ground there. They do pretty well in the detour, again being one of the few teams to choose the Mochi detour, and through that they're able to eventually catapult themselves to 5th place by the end of the leg. So on paper, this was a pretty strong leg for them. They also talk a little bit about how they're on the older side, and through that they had to be working smarter instead of harder, particularly when they're trying to get on the earlier flight. So again, this wasn't the worst leg in the world for them, and I feel like I'm a bit higher on them now than I was before. But even then, I feel like I'm probably higher on other teams. And even with their content, I feel like I wasn't learning much about them outside the fact that Melinda is on the older side of things. So I feel like for those reasons, I did decide to leave them behind here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this team has gone down compared to last week. And here we have Bernie and Kerrigan. And this was sort of the opposite for me compared to Melinda and Erica, where this was actually a pretty bad leg for them, where despite them coming into the leg in a pretty good spot where they probably should have gone on to the second flight at least, they really get lost on the way to the travel agency, and that really causes them to be stuck on the latest flight. They obviously get into an argument at the airport. They're shown giving up on trying to get onto the second flight at the airport and kind of get dunked on because of that. And again, a lot of their early leg is particularly bad. However, they are able to recover quite a bit once they're actually in Japan, to where we see them doing pretty well on the intersection, being able to go from second to last in order to fifth place, middle of the pack. And they do okay in the detour. They eventually squeak out a eighth place finish. So it was a bit of a roller coaster of a leg for them. But really, I feel like I'm probably a bit lower on their racing ability after this leg, considering that they got lost on the way to their travel agency, considering they got into an argument. And while it was impressive, they were able to dig themselves out of a hole. I'm still higher on other teams at this point, which is why they're here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a team who I didn't really change my view on either. I feel like I came out of this leg feeling just fine about them. And here we have Courtney and Jasmine. And this was just kind of an okay leg for them, where they end up getting lost on the way to the travel agency, but despite that, they're still able to get onto the second flight, which again, not too bad there. And they're just kind of in the middle of the pack for the entire leg, not really falling too far behind, but also not really jumping ahead, to where they end up finishing this leg in 6th place, never falling below 8th place. And in general, this is just kind of a fine leg for them. They're just kind of a fine team. Don't really stand out too much in that regard, which is why they're here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this is a team that had a very turbulent leg. However, they are actually remaining around the same spot compared to last week on the ranking, and here we have Nick and Mike. And this was obviously a very turbulent leg for them, where they actually came into the leg in a pretty okay spot, being in 6th place, and they're able to maintain that coming through the intersection. They're actually the second group to finish the intersection, meaning that they were 3rd place coming to the detour. But we see them really struggle on the detour, the sumo detour, that really caused them to fall way behind to 9th place coming out of that, and even fall to 10th place by the time of the pit stop there. So while they actually did okay for a lot of the leg, they really fell apart during that final task that is obviously not particularly great for them on that end. But at the same time, I feel like from a storytelling perspective, they're still noteworthy characters on the show. We even seen this episode that Alyssa and Josiah talk about having bonded with them during the intersection. So I feel like there's definitely some legs for them to stand on moving forward. And while they did have that one pretty bad task, I think they're still capable of catching up. But I feel like I'm probably higher on other teams at this point, which is why they're here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a team that I'm very conflicted on from a race perspective, but from an edit perspective, they've been getting a lot of content on the show, and here we have Scott and Lori. And this leg was obviously a big roller coaster for them as well, where they started off at a massive disadvantage, where despite them being 9th place, they end up being on the last flight, and obviously that's a massive disadvantage there, and they're even last place coming into the intersection. However, through them working with Bernie and Kerrigan, they're able to make up a lot of ground there, jumping to the middle of the pack, and they're able to catapult themselves even further on the detour, where they do very well in the sumo task and end up finishing in 2nd place despite how bad of a start they had. So I feel like this is definitely a massive roller coaster for them from a race perspective, though I think a major reason why they're as high as they are is they're pretty big characters on the show despite that, where despite them not causing the most drama, where we see Bernie and Kerrigan having their fight, we still see Scott and Lori getting pretty positive content where they talk about how they met. They get a lot of personal content there. They also seem to be the more level-headed group. They don't get as negative content for ending up on the last flight. And obviously the fact that they do very well. They have this massive streak that allows them to go from the back of the pack to the front of the pack. So I feel like those two factors are a major reason why they are as high as they are. Though I think the top 4 teams are probably a bit more consistent from a race perspective, and that's a major reason why they decided to leave them behind here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this team was pretty much the opposite of Scott and Laura this week, and here we have Brett and Mark. And I feel like Brett and Mark are the complete opposite of Scott and Lori, where they started off in the front of the pack, being 2nd place. They end up on the first flight, which is obviously a pretty massive advantage there, and they're even the first group to end up in the intersection alongside Ernest and Bridget. However, they really fall apart during that intersection, really falling behind to the back of the pack, to where they're actually last place coming out of that, and they end up in 11th place coming into the detour, and they don't do particularly great there, getting 10th place coming out of that, and they're able to make up a little bit of ground to where they're 9th place by the end of it, but really a pretty massive collapse across the leg here, where they came into it in 2nd place, only to fall to 9th place. And there's definitely a debate for them being lower than Scott and Lori here, though the reason why I decided to leave them around the same spot is that I feel like they could still recover in the future. There's obviously some wonkiness involved with the intersection, and I feel like with them still getting pretty positive content beyond that, I think there's definitely a debate for them to potentially catch up in the future. Though again, considering how bad they performed across the actual leg, I did have to bump them all the way down here to number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is a team that is also a bit inconsistent, but they ended up doing pretty well by the end of it. And here we have Jonathan and Anna, who ended up winning the leg by the end of it, despite having a pretty mediocre start where they were 8th place coming into the leg. They were on the second flight. Though once they landed in Japan, they ended up doing pretty well, where they ended up in the second intersection group, and they ended up being the first to finish that. They're the second place coming into Detour. They do very well in the sumo task, and they ended up winning the leg by the end of it. Very much a roller coaster of a leg for them as well. And there was plenty of setup to it with them talking early on about how it was their anniversary and how this would mean a lot to them. And obviously, there was definitely setup to them winning the leg from an edit standpoint. And I still think they're a pretty big focus in the edit up to this point. And while they're not the most consistent racers in the world, I feel like they're definitely a team that we're meant to be looking out for in the future. And that's a major reason why I had them as contenders for the time being. But I feel like I'm a bit more confident in the top 2 teams from a race perspective, which is why they're here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and these top 2 teams are probably the most consistent through these first 2 legs from a race perspective, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Alyssa and Josiah here. And I feel like they've been a pretty consistent team up to this point where they were 5th place coming into this leg, and they remain around the top half for the entire leg. They were the 3rd intersection group, but the 2nd one to finish. 4th place coming into the Detour, 3rd to finish, and they end up with a 3rd place finish. Pretty strong, pretty consistent for the most part there. And again, I feel like they're a team that seems pretty well rounded on paper and a team that I would expect to do well in the future. Though at the same time, they are a bit boring, if I'm being honest. They don't really have that much in ways of personal content, and I feel like their placement here is largely due to their performance across these first 2 legs. Whereas I feel like the team that I have at number 1 has gotten more personal content on top of them doing pretty well from a race standpoint. So it's for that reason that I did decide to leave Alyssa and Josiah a little bit lower here at number 2. And now at number 1, the team that I believe is the most likely to win the Amazing Race 37 at this current point is Carson and Jack. And I feel like this was a pretty strong showing for them across his leg. Mind you, they did technically go down compared to last week where they were 1st place coming into the leg in 1st place, part of the first flight. And they do technically have a downslide to where they eventually end up in 4th place by the end of it, largely due to their performance on the Detour, where despite them being the first team to finish the intersection, they did struggle a little bit on that Detour that caused them to fall a little bit behind. Though at the same time, not to a ridiculous degree, and they still ended up doing pretty well by the end of it. And again, I feel like compared to Alyssa and Josiah, they've probably gotten a bit more personal content on the show, where in this episode they get their intro package talking about how they're big nerds and D&D players, and that this is your chance to feel like real heroes. So I feel like they're a bit more defined as a team from a storytelling perspective, and that's the main thing that edges them above Alyssa and Josiah, even though I feel like Alyssa and Josiah seem to be a bit more consistent racers up to this point. But I feel like it's the fact that Carson and Jack are a bit more defined in the edit that gives them the edge for me, which is why they're here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Survivor 48 and Australian Survivor, so be on the lookout for videos on those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.